But it was really interesting to me to learn about this EMF, mold, and mycotoxin connection because it changed the game in a huge way. And I really developed a much deeper understanding of why indoor mold has become the problem that it has become.
Welcome to The Way Forward, the podcast that dives deep into how technology shapes our health and well-being. From digital wellness to tech innovation to the effects of electromagnetic fields, we cover the environmental, social, and physical implications of technology. Ready to navigate the digital landscape with confidence? Set your dial to Discovery and tune in. You're listening to The Way Forward. Jennifer Nitrio, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Absolutely great to be here.
Let's start with just a little bit about you and your background, because I always love kind of getting the history of how people ended up where they are.
Absolutely. So I was born, no, just kidding. But actually it kind of does come into play because literally I got brought home from the hospital and our basement flooded. And so it's kind of like I started this whole journey literally as an infant
Wow.
where I was just an attractor of water. And I didn't really obviously know until adulthood, what that really meant. And so previous, to my big mold exposure that really launched my career and everything that I've done since then, I wasn't really mold savvy. I had definitely been living in some very old homes. There definitely were mold issues, but you weren't exposed to this idea that mold is a bad thing.
Mm.
It's just kind of like, oh yeah, mold, whatever, spray some bleach on it, which we now know is like the worst thing that you can possibly do. So it wasn't until I moved into what is affectionately now known as the moldy house, that I started to have very, very bizarre health issues. And these all coincided with me having my daughter. So, of course, everything gets blamed on hormones when you're a new mother and your system isn't working right. But when it's coupled with your daughter being born with issues that they can't figure out, and like some pretty significant, strange, rare things that just
Mm.
didn't have an explanation, you just kind of start to wonder, like, well, what is going on? So we lived at the time in an area, it was an agricultural area. And we were basically on the downhill slope. So even though in California, when we would have droughts, we constantly had agricultural runoff. So, my brain is just kind of like we're getting exposed to things I don't like because of that, pesticides and all
Yeah.
kinds of, fertilizers and things like that. So you kind of write off weird stuff just with, okay, you know what, it's our area, environmental exposure. And I was already a pretty like natural living type person. So I wasn't using chemicals in the home, try to eat as clean as possible. But despite all of that, I just kept getting sicker and sicker and stranger things. And, the doctor I'm a big naturopathic type person, but I kind of became this medical mystery. And it got to the point that I was going to the ER really regularly, having heart attacks,
Mm.
except I was not having heart attacks.
Yeah.
And so, it just all these things kind of compound. Well, I knew more about mold because I had been in this natural living circle. I was doing ghostwriting for a lot of different natural health practitioners. So I was starting to learn more and more about mold. Got connected with a couple of people who had been on this mold journey themselves. And the light still didn't quite come on for me, but long story short, my daughter had to have hernia surgery and she was recovering on the couch. And we had a cat at the time who came out from behind the couch and jumped up on her. And she just like pushed him away and said, "Oh, mom, he smells so bad." So I go and grab him and I'm like, now, he never came from behind the couch before. Like that was not his hiding spot. It was just, it was very odd that he came from there, but he smelled like mold. And I'm like, what in the world did you get into? So I pull the couch away, and the smell that came up knocked my daughter and I out. It was so obnoxious. And I'm like,
Wow.
what in the world? So I'm feeling the carpet, and I'm like, why is the carpet damp under here?
Quick break in the episode, you guys, because I got to tell you about the amazing sponsor, Aries Tech. Aries Tech creates cream of the crop, top of the line EMF protection devices that do not interfere with your signal, but all of their technology is actually backed by peer-reviewed, patent, and published research that has been going on for almost 20 years. They were originally funded a couple decades ago by the military to create a medical device that would help protect men and women who are working on radio signal towers without interfering with the signal, and have since become a consumer product as we have become more of a technological world. They're also used by professional athletes like Tiki Barber from the NFL Giants and Macy Barber from the UFC for performance optimization tools. You can go to their website, ariestech.com, and check out some really amazing studies where they've done some EEGs to show how these devices are affecting your baseline brain activity. It's really, really cool. I personally have one on me right now near me because I have my phone, my computer, my camera, everything going on all at once in an office building where everyone has their own Wi-Fi. So I don't mess around. Check them out, ariestech.com. Use code INTUNE, INTUNE, TUNE 30 for 30% off your entire order.
And then it was just the floodgates of knowledge opened, and I'm like, mold. Oh my gosh, mold. We have mold.
Yeah.
So I was really, really fortunate to have the late Dr. Jack Thrasher live literally one block directly behind me. And he was the nation's leading toxicologist at that time, and really a pioneer in the studies of mold and mycotoxins.
Wow.
So I got in touch with him immediately. He was at my house in like 20 minutes, and my walls, floor to ceiling, were saturated. I mean, 100% saturation, floor to ceiling. But the weird thing is we had no visible mold whatsoever. But then all these things started kind of flooding in, like, oh, there was the time that I moved that and that felt damp. And I thought that was kind of strange and figured maybe my daughter had spilled something. So all these little pieces of information start dumping in. And then Dr. Thrasher is showing me that it wasn't my baseboards being painted a tan color. That was water staining.
Wow.
And I mean, you talk about mind blown. So he does all kinds of tests on the home. He does tests on me. And basically, after everything came back, he said, get out right now and don't take anything. Huh?
Yeah.
You know, what do you mean get out right now? So everything that happened from that point forward is really what spurred me. Once I kind of got my life resettled, I moved to Arizona with my daughter. And, you know, I said, I really don't want anybody to ever have to go through what we went through, because there's no reason for it. There's, you know, a lot of ways that we can prevent mold. There's a lot of ways we can understand what's happening. But more importantly, when you're really, really sick and you're being dismissed and you don't have visible mold, you know, what can I do? How can I help people so they don't have to go through something this significant?
Yeah.
So that is what spurred me forward. And I was very fortunate. I mean, I went through all the regular channels to become a certified mold inspector. I've done a lot of additional training in terms of remediation. I do a lot of training with the companies that produce specific products too, so I can become as close of an expert into, you know, the proper use of those. So I really have a lot of tools to give people to find the best solution. But I had Dr. Jack Thrasher. And that was the biggest, most valuable resource, because I essentially became a mycotoxin expert when I didn't even know what a mycotoxin was prior to all of this happening. Everybody hears about mold, but you don't hear about mycotoxins. And that's really where the game changes. And so I was so fortunate to get that knowledge and just, I mean, dive into everything he'd ever done in terms of research and studies. And my family actually became a case study for him.
Wow.
Because our levels of specifically the mycotoxin trichothecene were so off the charts high for not having visible mold that it was a rarity to see something like that. And it was a rarity that we were basically still alive and functioning. I mean,
Wow.
I'll use functioning loosely, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the very abbreviated
Yeah. It's really
9-year
interesting
story.
because I feel like mold is such a huge conversation now, but it was like, where was this conversation like decades ago? You know, like it didn't seem
It
like that was
wasn't.
ever a thing.
No.
But it also
Well,
seems like it's
yeah.
more prevalent. Like I think we've all like there's a lot of conversations. I've actually been listening to a lot of podcasts where people have very different ideas about mold. Some people think like, oh, well, we've been dealing with mold forever, so you know, it's not that big of a deal, and like all of that. But I feel like it's become such a big issue because mold kind of like exacerbates, I can never say that word right, but every other thing that's going
Yep.
on. So it's like, yeah,
Yep.
well, we've also like every other toxin is just like we've just been growing our
Mhm.
families and our children in this like toxic load, and then mold comes along and like just kind of pushes everything. I was talking to
Yep.
Dr. Jill Carnahan. Do you know her?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I talked to her yesterday. So this is a great like segue into this conversation because I learned a lot from her. But she was basically talking about like that toxic overload and like how we can have
Mhm.
all of these different viruses like Lyme disease and all these things that are just kind of laying dormant. Like a lot of people have them, but then when they get exposed to mold, everything
Yep.
kind of like kickstarts, and all of these things that
Yep.
we had laying dormant from like a small child comes into
Mhm.
play. And so then people start to look like they are like hypochondriacs because you know,
Oh yes.
yes, well,
Oh
we had a
yes.
mold issue in our previous home, and it was just one of those things that it was like no one really took it seriously. The doctor, like I took my kids to the doctor and they were basically like, oh, you don't want to get mold testing because your insurance doesn't cover it, and like all the things. So we ended up having to go to a chiropractor to get my son tested, and we only got my son tested because my son had lived in the house his whole life. So we knew that if his levels
Uh,
were high, everyone's levels were going to be high. And so his levels were like off the charts, but we actually don't
mhm.
know the type of mold. So do you
Mhm.
know like the different types of I feel like that's a really good place to start is like what are the tests? What is the best
Mhm.
tests? And like what are you really looking for?
Absolutely. So when it comes to remediation, we'll just kind of skip ahead to that and then backtrack.
Okay.
It does not matter what the type of mold is. So if you know you have a mold issue, we're going to go about remediating in, a pretty systematic way to make sure that we're getting everything out of the home. Different companies have different approaches, some better than others. Nobody remediates for mycotoxins, and that's the bigger issue. So that's where it becomes important to A, know your molds, but B, also know your mycotoxins.
Okay. So
And so
explain
if
that.
you,
Yeah.
yes, so if you've been experiencing a lot of health issues, or even if they're kind of minor, but like unique to you, I don't get seasonal allergies. All of a sudden now I'm,
Yeah.
reactive to everything. So,
Mhm.
if it's something, because you know your body, if you're a parent, you know your children, you know the kinds of things that they typically, we all have kind of those weak spots in our system. Some of us get coughs easier and things like that. So, really paying attention to those things. And it becomes important to know the types of mold and then the mycotoxins when it comes to getting your actual self cared for. We can assume if you've had water damage that you have a mycotoxin producing mold. So let's kind of start with that. So there are allergenic molds, and those are going to be the molds that most everybody on this planet is going to have kind of more of that respiratory type response to. So, you might notice your eyes are a little bit more watery, you're sneezing a little bit more. So those molds are more just kind of the allergenic response. Not that they're not harmful; it's still not good to have. I mean, mold should be outside. That's its place and purpose, not inside. And so, that kind of mold, though, for most people is the one that they miss. They're blaming it on something else.
Right.
Then there's the molds that are the toxigenic molds, and these are the molds where you're seeing neurological type issues. You're seeing a lot of systemic infections that you can't clear because your body's defenses have really been compromised. You're seeing organ issues, whether that's functionality or actual damage because your organs can't detoxify this. And that's compounded by the HLA-DR genetic mutation that some people have. They literally cannot detox mold from their system. And then you have just complete immune suppression. So these toxigenic molds, how they work is they produce a byproduct when they feel threatened. And by threatened, I mean for space. So there could be competing species of mold all in an area, and the best mold wants to win. They could be competing for food. It could be the same one single species of mold that is competing for food. So it's growing prolifically, and there's just not enough of a food source for it. It could be feeling threatened because somebody came in and poked a hole in the wall to send a camera in to see if there's mold in the wall. Now you've disturbed it. So anytime mold feels threatened, a toxigenic mold feels threatened, it will produce mycotoxins. So the mycotoxin is
It's a
the
little army.
chemical, yes, it is the chemical byproduct that protects the mold. And that is really what is going to do the most harm to human health. And for a lot of people, depending on the length of exposure and either the number of mycotoxins they're exposed to, the specific types, I mean, these can be life threatening and life altering because some of the damage can't be undone or can't be undone easily. So it's very important to understand the mycotoxin picture in your home because that ultimately is what you need to address in terms of your health and being able to properly remediate your home. Um, anybody I work with, most, or I shouldn't say not anybody, but most everybody I work with that comes to me that's gone through a remediation process is still sick and they can't understand why. And I said, well, because nobody did anything about the mycotoxins.
Right.
And so unlike mold that sort of has a shelf life, and we know, okay, under these conditions, mold becomes dormant. And it's not that dormant mold is not responsible for any sort of, harm to human health because it is. But most people just, they're like, oh, okay, well, we sprayed the mold with this, and so now it's not active anymore. Mycotoxins don't work the same way. They don't just suddenly go to sleep because there's nothing for them to do. So they can live in your environment. And it's kind of weird to think of a chemical as living, but they can live in your environment for decades, the absolute decades, and continue to harm your health. Now, mycotoxins don't reproduce on their own. Mold has to produce the mycotoxins. So you can get rid of the mold. If you don't get rid of the mycotoxins, though, again, they're still causing harm. So
So does the
there's several.
mycotoxins, they can, once they've been produced by the mold, they continue to replicate, or it's
They
just
do
like,
not replicate on their
okay,
own.
so just
No,
what's
no.
there after the mold's gone, it will continue to
Correct.
be there. Okay.
Yes. And unlike mold, mold spores either are where they are in terms of active mold growth and they're growing and they're stuck to whatever they're growing on, or they're dormant, they're lightweight now. They fly around in dust, pet dander, people dander. I mean, all of that stuff, they move around like that. Mycotoxins don't necessarily do that. And so mycotoxins typically, I mean, there is some movement, but they typically land and stay put. And that's why, if a person has an issue, and let's say it's a fairly significant issue in a bathroom, you have to gut the bathroom, maybe replace some of the studs, they're thinking, okay, well, the issue was in here. So, all right, I did a couple tests around my house. The rest of my house looks okay. Doesn't look like there's a lot of cross contamination. But the mycotoxins could still be in little places that you would never think, because, oh, well, we removed all of this. And testing, down the hall isn't going to necessarily tell you, okay, there's this mycotoxin problem that, resulted from here. So when you're looking at mold tests, there's a lot of different ways to do that. You have some, like what I like to call the quick and dirty test. If you think you're being exposed to mold, but you don't have visible mold, literally it's the Petri dish method. And you're putting these around your house. You're leaving them for an hour with your normal airflow. You can culture them yourself. You kind of peek at them in 5 days to see if they're growing anything. If not, check again in 7. And then I look at the number of colonies, the size of the colonies, and I've gotten pretty good at recognizing certain molds.
Wow.
And so kind of doing just a spot check to see, okay, what's floating around in the air? Air tests, the professional air tests where you use a cassette and get a sample. Those are another tool of the trade, but unfortunately they've kind of become the standard that, okay, we do this air test and if it doesn't show anything, you don't have a problem. That's not necessarily true because it's a very, very, very short snapshot. And oftentimes it's being compared to what's going on in the outdoors because you want to see, is the outdoor level, sky high with something? Does that match a sky high level in your house? Okay, yes, it does. Oh, you don't have a mold problem. That's coming in from the outside, but that's not necessarily true. So, so I tell people don't necessarily jump to that cassette test. Like do this. They're like $3 each. I mean, it's a super cheap way to get a picture of what's going on through the whole house. From there, you can say, okay, now I need to actually bring in a mold inspector to do additional testing, or maybe I'm still going to do some do-it-yourself type testing. There are dust tests. So, either, people can go and do it themselves. You can bring somebody in. I'm very picky about how I collect dust. And so I have a process for people because I want a very accurate picture of what's going on. And a lot of people make a mistake. They'll take samples by a front door, they'll take samples by a window. Well, you have natural movement of mold spores coming in and out of windows and doors. So,
Mm.
you really want to be understanding of where to take these tests so you get the correct picture. A dust test is also how we look for mycotoxins. Although there is a new technology that's come out with a cassette sample for mycotoxins, and I'm really anxious to get my hands on this and try it because, I want to see
Yeah.
how that's working. I have to find a loaded place with
Yeah.
mycotoxins though to, it's like, okay, what do I do? Put this out on like my, Craigslist. Hey, looking for somebody
Yeah.
with a mold contaminated home,
Yeah.
I'll do free mycotoxin testing. So there's this new technology that I'm really curious to see. It works similarly to an air cassette sample for mold. So I'll be curious. But yeah, so looking at the dust test, that can give you a couple of different views depending on how you do it. It can give you a historical view that kind of looks back at historical dust to see what has been in your home and continues to be in your home, or you can do it where you're looking at what has happened in a 2-week time period.
Mm.
So again, depending on a specific situation, if you have visible mold, I wouldn't ever waste money on a dust test because you have visible mold. So
Right.
you have a
Right.
problem. Let's see how far it's traveled though.
Yeah, we had an issue because it was like what, so we did find mold in our closet. It was not remediated well. And but they did the petri dishes and everything was coming back okay on the petri dishes. So like it was like, okay, well, everything's good. And then like our issues continued. And I was like, no, it's still here. I can feel it. It's still here. And so I didn't know that until yesterday. Literally, I didn't know that the like a lot of the really most toxic, I don't know if so is black mold considered a mycotoxin or
That would be a mycotoxin producing mold.
okay. So
Yes.
because
Yeah.
Jill was saying like all of the what really matters to your health, a lot like what like the most intense stuff is going to be found in dust and it's not going to be just like floating in the air. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know.
Exactly. Well, and that's true because every mold has a different weight to it. So Stachybotrys, which is kind of the dreaded black mold, it's not the
Okay.
only black mold, but that's the dreaded black mold. That is a very, very heavy mold. And if I ever catch that in an air sample, even one mold spore, that is a huge problem because it moved and it doesn't often move.
Mm.
So the only time you'll really see movement is like if I come in to do testing for somebody and they have just knocked out a portion of the wall because they knew that they had mold behind it, that just scattered everything everywhere. So yes, then I will oftentimes catch everything under the sun, in that sample just because you just released 200,000 spores into your living room kind of thing. But without that happening, yes, there are some molds that are very heavy and are tough to catch in a traditional air sample type environment. So that's why I like to use a lot of tools. A mold inspector will sometimes drill a small hole into the wall. We can take core samples where we can actually test some of your drywall to see, you can literally cut a small square out too and, test it that way. But again, releasing mold spores,
Right.
even with a small cut, you're putting a home at risk. You can send a camera in. That can be a little tricky depending on the age of the home too. It's not, I'm never going to rely on this camera and say, oh, that spot for sure is mold. But I do love core sampling if somebody has a really strong suspicion of a mold issue, but we can't find it. There's no signs of water damage. The petri dish or the air samples aren't coming back looking horrible, but they feel a certain way when they're in a space. That's when I love to do some core sampling and see, can we catch this somewhere, knowing, okay. And a lot of times, when it's a lot of investigation for a mold inspector, I have to go up on a roof. Okay, you're telling me you feel sick in this room. Great. Okay, let me go up on the roof. Roof looks great. I don't see water coming in. Can I get into your attic? Okay, let's go in above. Oh, actually, look what we have here. And so for some people, especially when it's a hidden issue, you really do have to have a trained inspector come in because, we see little details. And I've come in after, a homeowner has done their own inspection And I'll walk into a room and say, oh, okay, well, do you have any idea what happened right there? Oh, I didn't even see that. So, again, there is value in having a trained eye when you are doing certain tests, not getting the information. The ERMI test, which is it can also be a Hertzme, which are types of dust tests. People oftentimes do themselves and then go into a complete panic about it. Or because they didn't do it right, they're not getting anything. And they're like, but I know it's an issue. So it's a real slippery slope. I really like to have a lot of different testing options so we can really, really figure out for somebody what's going on. Um, and then again, there's okay, if you have these molds, we don't need to do a mycotoxin test. We know you have mycotoxins if you have these molds. There's no chance on this planet that they didn't at some point release mycotoxins.
Mm.
And so let's just treat for mycotoxins. Let's just figure out the best game plan here and move forward with that.
Okay. This is so interesting. I'm like, because
I can talk about mold forever.
Yeah, but it's like a really scary thing because it's like also very it's very costly. And then it's like, okay, well, is your home ever safe? Or is it like, and also, are you finding mold in every home that you're going in? Is it everywhere?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So like at what point do you like have to how do you balance that fear with like, okay, well, we know that mold is everywhere. Where is that like, you know what I'm saying? Like, where's that boundary?
Yeah. And that's what I talk, I kind of become a counselor too for a lot of my clients because I went through it myself. I tried to become mold perfect.
Yeah.
I was schooled over and over again. I could not, I moved 10 times in the first year after I left my house. I could not find a safe space. And it's tricky because you have sick people, you have mold sick people, and they have to get to the most pristine environment that they can in order to start the healing process. You can put a band-aid on things while you're living in mold, but you can't heal. It's
Right.
impossible. So how do you go find someplace you can feel healthy and heal in? And that is so individual because we all have our tolerance and we all have the things in our system that are going wrong. And, for a lot of people, that means they go tent camp for 6 months because that's where they're feeling safest and that's where they're feeling the healthiest. Other people find a very safe room in a motel that works for them. I spent plenty of time in motels myself. And so, a lot of times it's just figuring out where can I get to that's good enough right now that I can actually do some healing in before I go try to find a longer term place to live. Or maybe that turns into the longer term place. But it is hard. We have to learn how to become our own investigators. We have to really learn how to become advocates with property management companies and landlords.
Yeah.
And there's more and more clauses in rental agreements now related to mold and basically limiting the liability that
like you're responsible for it.
Yeah, they don't want to have to pay for this because honestly, that's expensive. They don't want to know about it. Um, and so even getting a landlord to, agree to letting you do testing beforehand, the second you say that to a landlord or property management company, they're like, nope, we're not renting to you because we don't want to know that there's a mold problem. And so it is very tough to find a safe home. My house now, thank you, Mother Nature. So, I have a track record. But I lost my home a few years ago during a really violent storm. We got hit. They call them microbursts here in Arizona. That's BS. It's just basically a tornado that doesn't actually touch the ground. So, my house got destroyed and I had to completely rebuild it. So at this exact moment, I feel really confident about my house because I oversaw the entire process, but I can't tell you how many pieces of wood I had to make them replace. I'm like, you've got to be kidding. This is full of mold. Why did you put this up? What are you doing? And the contractor, well, no, we'll just encapsulate that. No. Don't, no. Nope.
That doesn't work with me. Thank you.
Nope. Start over. And I was so paranoid watching the house get built. But when you really watch how homes are constructed, apartment buildings are constructed, they come in with moldy wood. They sit and languish in bad weather and nobody's doing anything to protect them, depending on the type of the wood. So here in Arizona, we are only allowed to use one type of wood. And thank goodness it's the best way to prevent mold on wood. It still happens, obviously. But other parts of the country, they don't have regulations around that. So they can come in with really green, raw, wet wood, and then they're slapping drywall right up on it. So
Mm.
even a new build can end up with a mold issue pretty quickly. So again, it's prevention, prevention, prevention. It's being a good tenant or homeowner. And people get kind of lazy about it, but every month have your checklist and go check all these things.
Yeah. Okay. So what
Um,
is that? Like, what does prevention look like?
Obviously leaks, that's a big one. And there's a lot of ways that you can get alerts about those the second that they happen. So if you're a homeowner, for literally $300, you can put a monitoring system on your plumbing and it will tell you if there's unusual water flow. I mean, I left a garden hose on absentmindedly and it shut my water off 5 minutes later because it's like something's wrong. This is not normal water usage. I
Wow.
appreciate that. I mean, that's
Yeah.
huge. Not convenient when you're in the shower. So,
Right.
but
Get
and
in
that
there a
has
little too
happened.
long.
Yes. Um, that I mean, it's a very cheap, easy thing to do. If you do not have the ability to put a whole house, whole house-wide plumbing monitor on, you can use water leak detectors and sensors in areas where there's plumbing. That's not necessarily going to tell you what's going on behind a wall instantly. I mean, the water would eventually come through, but if you have a pipe under a sink, but it's going around, it's looking under your sinks, constantly checking for those. It's also, people don't realize you have to look down. People look up because you're looking for water leaks coming from your roof, but also look down and look for any changes at your baseboards. Do you have any areas where you're kind of like me? Oh, the carpet feels a little bit colder here than usual. Why would that be? Um, I always suggest everybody gets thermal imaging. There is zero reason. Fleur has an awesome little device that goes right onto your cell phone. It can go on an iPhone.
That's
It can
super
go on an
cool.
Android. They're about $300, and you can turn your phone into a thermal imaging device. I mean, these are things that up front people are like, I don't want to spend $300. You're gonna use this for 15 years. I mean, the technology is going to be the same. This is a great investment. After it rains, go around, look at your ceilings. Is there a
Yeah.
change in the heat pattern? And you have to really kind of know your house too, because you have to know areas that are cooler and warmer, by nature. But having those tools, having moisture meters,
Mm.
being able to go around with a moisture meter, you can get one for $30. So checking your walls, and again, just being diligent about these kind of things. Checking around your windows. Does the caulking need to be replaced? Or homes breathe, they expand, they contract. So, it's not unusual to see cracking around a window. I mean,
Yeah.
that even my house 2 months afterwards, because there was such a drastic temperature shift, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, nothing's caulked anymore. Okay. So, that's the thing. But, people, I think, get a little bit complacent and just feel like, oh, okay,
So if you catch water damage like as soon as it happens, there is a way
mhm.
like there is ways of making sure that, or is it like if there's water damage at all, you have mold?
So that depends on whether you have mold spores. So
Okay.
you have to have mold spores in order to have mold. It's why most people don't end up with a moldy shower the day after they take a shower, because, if you're keeping things relatively clean, then yeah, you're not going to end up with this massive mold issue. But if you never clean your shower, eventually an
Right.
airborne something's going to float in there. So if you don't have mold spores and you get it dried out within the first 24 hours, you likely will not develop a mold issue. The
Okay.
longer you wait to dry something out, the more likely you are to develop something, because let's face it,
Right.
all of us have a rogue mold spore from something somewhere.
Right.
And especially if you've had a previous mold issue, maybe it wasn't remediated properly, maybe they didn't do anything related to cross contamination. People, especially in high humidity areas, the ductwork, HVAC, breeding ground, and that just is
Yeah.
getting spewed all over your house. So, really, it's as fast as you can get something taken care of, the better. And professionally, I mean, putting some fans on a major situation and hoping that's going to do it. No, you need the heavy duty dehumidifiers, you need the air scrubbers, you need the heat, you need the negative air pressure. I mean, you need the things that a professional company can bring in and
Yeah.
do. And, unfortunately, a lot of people think, oh, I can dry this out myself and it will be fine. And that's normally where we see an issue get set up because they couldn't do it properly. They didn't have the proper tools.
Yeah. So the house that we just bought, that we moved into, the people that we bought it from said that they had a plumbing issue and that the half of the house basically flooded, but that like same day people came, they ripped up all the flooring, they did their whole drying system, but they also ended up having them take out half of the walls because they didn't want the moisture to like,
Perfect.
yeah. So I was like,
Mhm.
okay, well hopefully.
Yeah.
Because when she
Yeah.
said water damage, I was like, no, we're moving from
No.
one to another. But what's interesting, and I was talking to Dr. Jill about this yesterday, is we seem to kind of get sicker for a little bit after we moved out and into a new
Mhm.
environment. Because also, like, even though we moved kind of close, we were in a completely different terrain. Like, it
Mhm.
was all new types of trees and grasses and all the things. My kids started having like crazy allergies. Like my youngest was just constantly draining for like 4 weeks straight. And she was like, yeah, that's because your immune system was completely turned off. And then like
Yep.
once you're out of it and your body starts to like that bucket starts to go down just enough, your immune system kick starts and you start realizing all of the different sensitivities you've had, but
Yep.
you just like it's so wild. I'm like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But it's also a little relieving because it's like, okay, we're healing. Even though it's
Yeah.
like, we're going through this process, so we've been just doing everything we can to like help him through that process. But like, so what does that look like? So are you helping people also like physically? Or are you mostly on the side of like remediation and like home?
So I am not a medical practitioner,
Right.
so I'm very careful with how I do assist people. I share my experience, what worked, when it stopped working, what worked next, what I've learned since then.
Right.
All the things that have happened with additional exposure, how I keep myself safe because I'm a mold inspector. The last thing I want to do is go in
Right.
somewhere and compromise
Yeah,
my
that's
system.
quite
And
the
yeah,
job.
I know everyone's like, that is a very strange profession. And I'm like, well, I honestly would rather be on the mold prevention side and only do mold prevention, but we're not there yet. There's too much
People
mold in
aren't
this
and
world.
yeah, what and
Yeah.
people like aren't it's just like the nature of human beings to not be interested
Yeah.
in anything until they're like sick.
It's a crisis. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can share a lot of experiences of the people that I work with too, because I'm always trying to find other resources for people in different areas. Like, oh, this person that I worked with, saw this doctor and had amazing results. But I think the biggest thing I try to get people to really wrap their brain around, because this is the hardest part, and you touched on it, you leave the mold and you feel worse and you don't understand. And we have to remember our systems have bandwidth. And we can't heal all the things all at one time. Our systems, it's impossible to do that. And unfortunately, there's a lot of practitioners with their protocols where they're throwing so much at somebody saying, we're going to just get everything all at once. You can't do that. It's impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, we can even do a quick internet search with misinformation and you'll still figure out like it is impossible for the body to heal itself all at the same time. And so there's kind of the beginning of, okay, let's try to start grabbing some stuff and getting it out of your system. So there's a lot to be said for binders and using things that can really start sopping up some of this excess stuff that your body isn't really wanting to let go of on its own. And, then once you kind of get to a certain point, then you can really start targeting the things that weren't operating properly within your system. But sometimes what you think needs to be healed first is not what your body thinks needs to be healed first. So
Right.
you start doing work on something and you're like, I'm 3 months in and I'm making no progress. Okay, talk to your practitioner. Maybe you need to switch to a different body system. Maybe it's time to say, okay, you know what? Yeah, I know that I was getting, a lot of issues here in terms of like, let's just say gut health, but maybe
Yeah.
my gut's not ready. Maybe I have to go do this other thing first. Like my circulation is a mess.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at microcirculation. What are some of the things that we can do? Because and that's a lot of times, I'll hint to people like, hey, microcirculation. You have got to get your circulatory system moving because that's what allows all the organs to start pushing things out. And so, if you're stagnant and feeling like you're not healing, never be afraid to discuss with a practitioner like, dude, this isn't working.
Yeah,
You
because the
know?
mycotoxins are like they're settling in your muscles and stuff, right? Like,
Oh
how does that
yeah,
work?
yeah,
Yeah, because Dr.
yeah.
Jill was saying like, like dry brushing, like getting your like lymphs and
Yeah.
muscles and everything moving because everything's just like lodged. I'm like, oh
Well,
my
and movement, that's the hardest thing when people are so mold sick. The last thing we want to do is
God,
unplant
move.
ourselves from the couch.
Right.
But moving and gentle moving, that's the thing. Everybody, a lot of people who have mold sickness, they've either lost a ton of weight because they're not absorbing nutrients no matter what they eat, or they've gained a lot of weight because inflammation gone haywire. And, a lot of people who are on the side of I've gained a lot of weight are like, oh, I got to start, like lifting intense weights. I have to do all of this cardio. No, 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 that backfires. And same with the person who is, say, on the lower end of the weight scale, has lost a lot of weight. They're thinking, I shouldn't do anything because, I don't want to lose more weight. And, it's very gentle. There's a lot of exercise programs out there that are like metabolic type exercises. They're very, very gentle on the system. If all you can do is stretch every day and get on YouTube and find a gentle beginner stretching, not even like yoga, just true stretching, just get the body moving. And it needs to be a very slow progression. You can't tax it with intense exercise when you're trying to heal, because what do we do during exercise? We break muscle, we stretch tendons, we're creating scar tissue. We don't need to do more of that kind of thing. And so I think a lot of people also kind of go the do it yourself route, and they look
Yeah.
online and, okay, we'll do this, we'll do that. We'll go take saunas every day. Not everybody can go take saunas every day. It's not,
Yeah.
it's not going to work for everybody, and it can make them sicker. And people have to remember too, if you have mold in your system, and it amazes me that so many people gloss over sinuses. It's like, well, I don't have any sinus problems. You have mold spores that have colonized in your sinuses.
Mm.
What does mold do on your wall? It releases mycotoxins. What does mold do in your sinuses? It releases mycotoxins. Your body is producing mycotoxins. We're eating things with mycotoxins. I mean, and so it's making sure you're not skipping some of the very important steps on the front end,
Yeah.
because it will just end up being a continuous loop. And trust me, nobody loves doing sinus rinses 4 times a day.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Sinuses is where all my issues, literally my entire health journey started with chronic sinus infections as a kid. And so I know what that's like, but that's exactly
Right.
when I knew something was off, because we were pretty like, I've been on this journey for a long time. So like when we all started just like crashing out of nowhere, it was like, okay,
Yeah.
what is
What?
happening? What is happening?
Yeah.
Literally. And I started getting those chronic infections again. And I was like, okay, something is not right here. Like something is going on. And it is so hard when people don't take it seriously, because it's just been such a kind of taboo topic for so long, you know?
Oh yeah. And you never know what is going to trigger something even years later. I mean, I left my moldy house, and I had a decent period of healing. I got to Arizona in April of 15. I never felt better after I got here. I mean, it was amazing. I had for years and years and years felt horrible and had all these things going wrong, and it was just, I felt
Wow.
like a teenager. I was just,
Aw,
I
that's
wasn't,
amazing.
yeah, I wasn't healthy per se, but I mean, I was at this stage where it was like, oh my gosh, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And some of these issues my daughter had, just from getting out of that environment, cleared. And that will happen for some people. Certain things will get better, but then something happens. And
Mm,
that's where you get schooled that your system is not okay. And, like just this year in April, I got COVID for the first time. And, I shouldn't have bragged that,
yeah.
oh, I've avoided it this whole time. And I always thought, you know what? I know how to handle it. I'll be fine. 6 weeks. It
Wow.
laid me out for 6 weeks. I have never been so sick. I'm like, what? And oh my gosh, I'm like,
Yeah.
well, between age, but also just, okay, that's right. My body's not perfect.
Yeah.
It had gone through a lot. It's had a lot of stress, since then. I'm not perfectly healed. And boy, did it hit my weak spots. I mean, it was
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, it
And
was when you said before, like, it was right around the time you had your child that you started getting
mhm,
sick. That's the same thing that happened. Well, because we moved into that house while I was pregnant. And so then,
Yeah.
like, very, very soon after we had my son, and I was getting sick. I mean, I got sick back to back, like got strep throat and was like out for like 2 straight weeks. I mean, I had never been that sick, but just like
Yeah.
2 weeks, for 2 years after I had my son, and everything I thought about it was just like, oh, this is what's like to be a mother, you know? And it's like, no,
Right.
that's
So
not
we're sleep
normal.
deprived and
Yes, it is not
yeah.
normal for your body to be like that deprived, that you are just getting everything under the sun. And
Hmm.
my friend was saying that to me about my kid, because whenever I sent him to school, and he's in a nature school, he's outside most of the time, he was getting sick. And I'm like, well, that's normal. Everyone says that, you know, your kid gets sick. And it's like, no, but your kid's immune system should be, especially with like the way that we live, it should be strong enough to combat those things that they're being
Hmm.
exposed to. They shouldn't really be
Yeah,
getting sick like that. If they are,
exactly.
something's going on. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
learn
And
so
it's,
much. The journey's never over.
oh yeah. And and that's the thing. It's like, yeah, kids need to get sick a couple times a
Yes.
year, maybe 3 times, and it should be pretty minor. And they might get something big. I mean,
Yeah. Right.
they strep throat or something like that. But parents, if they have the appropriate illnesses as children, they shouldn't be catching these things from their kids. And,
Right.
that's always a red flag. If you're literally catching everything from your
Yeah.
child, something's going on. It might not be mold, but I mean, you need to
Right.
look at your
Something's going
system
on.
and look
Yeah.
at your lifestyle and figure out. And, that was the same thing. I mean, my daughter, when she was little, I'm like, why is she getting sick? Where are we going where she's
Exactly. We
getting
weren't
sick?
even anywhere.
Exactly. Like, we're just both here
Yeah.
languishing away because you don't sleep and I'm
Yeah.
tired.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So how did you come into EMF? How did
Yes.
EMF become part of this conversation for you?
So I knew about EMFs before I really even understood mold.
Oh, wow.
I am one of those people that is just by nature of being me, pretty sensitive to a lot of things. And it only got worse after the mold. Now, I didn't necessarily know I had an EMF issue, like early on, but I was in my 20s and I got a very strange skin condition. And so it was like my skin couldn't actually, we lose skin cells every
Right.
single solitary day. We have to. I couldn't do it. My body couldn't, like, wanted to hang on to these things. And so it
Wow.
became a very uncomfortable, like, visually, it didn't look weird, but it became a very uncomfortable condition. And I had like itching underneath my skin. I mean, the best way to describe it
Mm.
is like if somebody just peeled a layer off, like it would be underneath there where it
Ah,
was itchy. So not an external itch. And it was actually a dermatologist who did a lot of work in New Zealand where they have a completely different look at things. And he said that when you're here in the US, there's so many things that we're exposed to. And he was the one that suggested to me that I was a rare person who has a reaction to basically radio waves.
wow.
And he's like, based on where you're living, how close are you to substations, power lines, like looking at big sources of, what we have now kind of just lumped together as EMFs.
Yeah.
I'm like, weird. So there wasn't a lot back in like 2002 on
Yeah.
EMFs. I mean, a little bit here and there, but we were focused more back then on like a microwave. Now people were starting to think like we should stand in front of a microwave.
Yes.
But again, it wasn't so much like the EMFs. It was, we don't want it cooking our liver while we're standing in front of it. So again, it was just like trying to understand this and piece together like the strange reaction. And so I kind of had an earlier exposure but not really an understanding.
Right.
And it wasn't until really kind of the cell phone game started to kick in where everybody had a cell phone. You and I are from generations where we did not have that. And, as these cell phones started getting fancier and doing more things, and there's more talk about, hey, men, don't put it in your front pocket. We're seeing men go sterile. And
Yeah.
you're like, what in the world is this all about? And so, before I had my daughter, I was really already looking at EMFs and I was kind of wigged out by the whole thing. And, I was like, oh, okay, we don't want this Wi-Fi over here. Like the baby's going to be here. The baby was not there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like we all think our babies are going to be in a crib sleeping all
Yeah. Yeah.
night
Yeah.
long.
Oh,
So
right.
no, Yeah, that fun
Yeah.
fallacy. So sorry, moms who are pregnant right now and have never been a mom, but your baby's not going to be in that crib.
Yeah, that nursery,
Um,
it's a lot of time
yep,
wasted. A lot of
biggest
time and
waste of
money.
money there ever was, the
Yeah.
nursery.
Yeah. It really.
um, so I kind of did dive down the rabbit hole, and then after I had my daughter and I quit the job that I had and started ghostwriting and really learning about EMFs, it was like, whoa, oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
So you were writing
So
for other practitioners on this topic and having to like research it and
mhm,
stuff. That's so funny because people
yeah.
are doing that with the wave. I have, friends who were just phenomenal writers that I asked to come on to help me write the blog. And they're all like, "Oh my God." Like I had no
Yeah.
idea. I'm like, this is why we
Yeah.
do this. Yeah.
Exactly. And when and this was obviously during a time too. I mean, my daughter was born in 2009. And so, I started ghostwriting in 2010, and this was really before you could ask the internet anything. I mean, you had to still really look up studies. You could find them on the internet, but I mean, I was going to scientific journals, and it was so just poof over my head. I mean, there was not a layperson's explanation and
Right.
understanding of,
Yeah.
and there were all these studies out there, and just like, okay, but this one says it's not that bad and this one says it's terrible, and so I think that for the general public, it was really when 5G started to be,
Yeah.
kind of front and center, where the conversation got big, because now 5G suddenly seemed scary. But why? Why were we not more concerned about EMFs? And it was not really until I started to take a deep dive down the rabbit hole of 5G, because I was seeing all these teeny tiny little 5G things going up in the neighborhood, and I'm like, this isn't cool with me. Like, why do we need so many of them?
I know.
And
So
I
close
also live
together.
like, yeah, and I also live right by a substation and at the base of a military base where, who knows what's coming out of there.
Yeah.
And, so I have done so much research into protecting the exterior of my home, but also the interior and my person. And so when I started to learn more and more about 5G, that's when I sort of accidentally learned how mold starts to react in the
Mm.
presence of any sort of EMFs. And I mean, if you, my mouth just hit the floor. It was like, what, huh? Oh my gosh, like this is a game changer. Like this is completely now shifted the conversations that I have with people, because we can't just talk about food sources being water or being, some kind of humid environment, or being wallpaper glue, or being book glue, or, all the things that mold can proliferate on. Now we have to talk about the EMFs in your house, and y'all are going to think I'm a nut job, because
Right.
I mean, how many mold inspectors walk in and also start looking at the EMF load in a home? Hardly anybody.
So do you do
And
that when you're in people's house? That's
absolutely. Mhm.
amazing. That is amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, people are always very floored at how many electronics they have plugged in. And I'll go through and do a count, and they're like, oh, but I mean, that's just plugged in. It's not turned on. I'm like, it's plugged in. It's on. Like, if you have anything plugged in, it's doing a thing, doesn't
Doing a
have to be
thing.
working, but it's doing a thing. And, I mean, even just sitting here looking at my desk, the previous version of me, I would have just seen a laptop. No, there is a backup drive that's plugged into the wall. My desk is an up and down desk. That's plugged into the wall. There's a phone charger in the wall. There's the actual laptop plugged into the wall. Oh, wait. Oh, what's this over here? And so you start to look around. I'm like, oh my God, that's 6 things plugged into like 1 inch
That I'm sitting
that
on,
I'm
basically.
sitting in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cooking me right now. And
Yeah.
that's just my desk, and these are minor things. I mean, these are not major appliances in a home. This is not your Wi-Fi. I mean, and obviously we have to plug stuff in.
Yeah.
We can't turn our power out at night when we go to sleep, which would be ideal to sleep in a powerless environment. We got to keep our food cold.
Yeah.
People like to have their phones on and want the Wi-Fi. I mean, so, but it was really interesting to me to learn about this EMF, mold, and mycotoxin connection, because it changed the game in a huge way. And I mean, I really developed a much deeper understanding of why indoor mold has become the problem that it has become.
That's a really good point.
Yes.
That really hasn't been made. Cause I'm like, it is such a big thing now. But
Yeah.
also everybody has Wi-Fi in their home and everybody has all of these things
Mhm.
that we just didn't have before.
Yep, exactly. And so when you think about mold, there's there's two things in this world we don't like and we don't want in our homes, but they're critical to our environment, and that's mold and cockroaches. And they're also, they're also the two things that are going to be here long past humans, but they have very important jobs. They break down organic matter. If we did not have mold outside and if we did not have cockroaches outside, I can't even explain what our world would look like. They have very, very important jobs. But you bring those indoors and it's a problem. And the interesting thing, I've also become a bit of a cockroach expert because I
Just
tend
kind
to
of goes
get
hand
called
in
into,
hand.
right?
Yeah.
I tend to get called into like some hoarding situations. And so, I've had to become friends with these cockroaches, but they actually
Wow.
operate similar to mold. It's really very interesting. Cockroaches are uh, emboldened by EMFs, if you will.
Mm.
Yes, it's very interesting. So there's a lot of correlations between the two. But when mold gets indoors, it shouldn't be here. We're not supposed to have the mold indoors. But when you think back to, and I think back to as a kid, where unfortunately there was just a whole infrastructure issue in my neighborhood, and our basement would back up with everybody's sewage once a year. We didn't
Mm.
have mold issues out of that. Like, how
Wow.
how in the world did we not have mold? Like, and that was in the late 70s and early 80s. And it's kind of like, but how? Where was the mold? But we didn't have a lot of the compounding issues that we have today. And so when you look at mold and you look at mycotoxins and you look at EMFs, there is a very, very obvious and scientifically proven connection between why mold is such a serious issue now in indoor environments. And I mean, that can be your home, that can be an office, airport, restaurant. I mean, I encourage people, don't look too closely where you're shopping. Just don't, because we would never buy anything. I mean, when you realize how moldy everything is in this world, we'd
Yeah.
never, we'd all be literally running around starving and naked because we wouldn't want to go and get our groceries or clothes from anywhere.
Sleeping outside and yeah.
Yep. And
Wow.
so, EMFs not only amplify what is happening in the indoor environment from a mold and mycotoxin production perspective, but EMFs amplify what happens inside your system when you have been exposed to mold and mycotoxins. And, a lot of times people don't put, they kind of think of one but not the other. And, so if it can amplify what is happening in building material that is, covered in mold, then
Yeah.
think about what happens to your insides that are also covered in mold,
Yeah.
and
It
what
basically
exposing
starts
yourself.
working against you inside. You're like, you have now something inside you that's literally
Hmm.
working against your body and just
Yeah.
replicating. It's
Yeah.
not fun to think about.
No, and EMFs, I mean, before we get to what happens in your home or in a building, when you're exposed to EMFs and you already have a mold and mycotoxin situation going on in your system, so it disrupts detoxification. I mean, it's not that you can't do, a detoxification process, but it disrupts it. It's not going to work as well. It's going to take longer. It's going to send you back to square one. I mean, the EMFs are disrupting your body's ability to do what it would do naturally or with some assistance through supplementation. It also stimulates more mycotoxins to be released because if you recall, the point of mycotoxins is to protect the mold.
Right.
So if it's feeling threatened by the electromagnetic activity that you're being exposed to, the mold in your system is going to create more mycotoxins because
Right.
it's like, whoa, hold on now,
Yeah.
um, and then I mean, it's just going to also increase the entire toxic burden in your system because it's an EMF,
Yeah.
so you've added.
Even without understanding like every detail of the science, it makes complete sense because like I've talked to some different researchers. One of them was a neurologist and he was explaining how like we are electromagnetic beings and
Hmm.
like we rely on electrical currents to communicate and to turn genes on and off. So like if we're relying on that communication to turn the gene on or to turn whatever system on to be able to detoxify the mold, but then we have
Hmm.
these outside sources of electromagnetic fields and frequencies that are communicating with our bodies that are like so confusing, so completely abnormal to what we would naturally find in, you know, if we were to like go sit on the earth or if our body was in like a resting state. Is that something that people don't really realize? It's like everyone says, oh, well, EMFs are everywhere. It's always been everywhere, like they say with mold. But it's like, okay, yes, but like the frequency
Yeah,
differences are not just like small amount different. It's like we're talking hundreds of thousands of times faster frequencies,
drastic.
different frequencies. And so, yeah, that coming into like hitting our body all the time has to disrupt the systems that are in place, the communications in place to do these
Mhm.
types of things, like to turn these things on
Yep,
and off that need to keep us well.
exactly, exactly. And people don't really understand 10 years ago, basically looking at, pre 5G, even more rudimentary smartphones than we have now. I mean, our phones
Yeah,
today are basically mini, computers. But I mean, today's EMF load is several million times
right.
higher. I mean,
Yeah,
million. Like people need to really grasp that this is millions of times higher than just 10 years ago. Think about the next 10 years. I
yeah,
mean, if it went from that to that in a 10-year span, where are we going to be in another 10 years? Are we even going to be able to handle something like that?
right.
You
And
know,
everyone's saying, okay, well, we'll adapt. And I do partially agree that our body's going to try to adapt. But like,
Mhm.
how do we adapt when things are moving that fast? Like,
We
yeah,
can't do it successfully. And
right.
it really is going to be survival of the fittest. I mean, I have a lot of conversations with people where they're just like, gosh, I mean, how big is our population going to get before we can't support the people here? And I'm like, well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we are sort of in a very awful cycle right now where we are going to see survival of the fittest because of the things that we're putting into our environment, and
Yeah.
not just EMFs, I mean other things too. And this is where this is kind of, I don't like to call it an experiment, but it really,
Oh,
I'm
I
not
always call
saying
it an
one,
experiment. I'm like,
right?
we are in a
I'm
giant
not saying one
experiment.
person is doing this, but yeah, I mean, but it is going to prove, okay, what genes do we really need to be able to survive all this? What combination of genes do we need? What do we need in terms of all of these other outside factors, in order to survive this? And then not just survive it, but to actually function in a healthy way
Right.
where, I mean, I venture a guess 90% of us are fatigued and tired all the time.
Yeah.
I don't remember my parents being that worn
Yeah.
out back in 1982.
Yeah.
I came home from school and my mom's just perky and happy, and dad comes
Yeah.
home from work and plays with me and didn't seem tired. And it's like,
Dad was like, I don't even think I knew what autism was when I was in school
no, no.
because
I
it
mean,
was
it was,
so uncommon. Like he's like, I
yes.
might know have known what it was, but it wasn't, it was a very uncommon thing. It was not
Yeah,
like, you know, half of the kids in your class are on the spectrum or, it's just so
exactly.
different. And I'm like, so much has changed since then.
And we could eat whatever was at the grocery store because it wasn't that bad. I mean, things were still made with real sugar, not corn syrup and all
Yeah.
this other junk that's put in. I mean, I can sit there and remember, like, gosh, did we have tons of food dye and stuff? No. Things looked different. They weren't colorful. And so all these things that we've been doing over time and that continue to get worse because unfortunately, we've got to find a way to feed people, and we simply can't grow enough food, farm enough animals to feed the
The way
world's
that we are.
population.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it is going to be interesting as things progress, and I do hope we get to a point where finally somebody stands up and says, like we have to stop doing this. We have enough EMFs. We're good. We don't
Yeah.
need to add more. We don't
Everything's
need to go
moving
to
fast enough, at
6G.
least for right now. Like, let our bodies adjust to what's
Hmm.
happening. Because
And
the
that's
other thing,
exactly it.
yeah, the other thing that we were talking about, Dr. Rusty, if you guys are listening to this, his episode's probably live now. You can go listen to it. But he was talking about how, like, it's not like whenever, like, well, first off, all of the studies coming out that are showing harm are based off of like what you're talking about, like years ago when we were using 1G and 2G and we had like 900 megahertz, right?
Exactly.
And now
Yep.
we're in like the 300 gigahertz, which, like you said, is millions of times different than that. which we're seeing studies showing harm, clear studies showing clear
Mhm.
harm. And yeah, you're not going to have the like, you know, double plus whatever they do, what is the double blind
The
placebo?
blind placebos.
You
Yeah, yeah,
can't. You can't.
yeah.
We are that. We are the experiment right now. We like it is
Mhm.
already so worldwide deployed that it would be almost impossible to do that
Can't
unless
pull
you
it
had
back.
someone grow up in a Faraday cage. But like it's like
Right.
so he was talking about how like okay because we're not slowly increasing these bandwidths, we are exponentially
Correct.
increasing these bandwidths, but also when 5G deploys, 4G does not get shut off. It's not like, oh,
Nope.
okay, we're taking away
Nope.
4G and
They
now we're
layer
deploying
on.
5. Everything is layered on top of each other. So when you have these safety limits, which, you know, Dr. Kent in a previous episode talked about what these safety limits are based off of and how old they are and how like just
Yeah.
ridiculous they are. I mean, that's my opinion, but they are so ridiculous, these FCC regulations. But even if we were to say those are safe limits, they're not based on the compounding effect of what's happening. It's like, oh, they have a safety limit for 5G and like where
Yep.
they need to be in all of these things, but they're not basing that off of people having 25 different smart devices in their home and having, you know, 3 Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
My sister has 3 Wi-Fi routers in her home because she works from home. I'm like, dude,
Oh,
like,
wow.
yeah, like,
Wow.
you know, but that's normal for people. And like, I work in an office, the office I do the podcast in, every single office has their own Wi-Fi router. And there's
Yeah.
probably 35 offices in here. So they're not considering that. Like,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
is the
And
experiment.
exactly. And it's, when you think about the last time that they really did an FCC study,
Right.
like 20 years ago. I mean,
25 years ago. Yeah.
yeah, we did not have anything that we have today. Anything. And
And it
so,
was an
I mean,
acute study. So it was only based off, it was like an hour or 2 hour long study. It's based off of
yeah,
monkeys. I think it was monkeys and rats. And they
yep.
basically just increased the EMF exposure until the monkeys could no longer pull a lever to like get food
Mhm.
until they were so
Yeah,
disoriented. And then they
yeah.
divided that number by 50 and they said, okay, that's the maximum EMF exposure that we can have. But that's also only with like per devices. It's not like,
Mhm.
okay, well, we need to measure the EMF exposure that's happening in schools and make sure that we're not going to continue adding things in the surrounding area that's going to surpass the limits, you know?
Exactly.
It's not
Exactly.
that's what is happening. In some countries it is. Like I bet in New Zealand they have some things like that going on. I know
Yeah.
like in Russia and in Italy and France, there's certain countries that do have a little bit of safety limits, and especially with children, because children are a lot more at risk.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but also what's so interesting about those countries is that they're the countries that have the longest standing research.
Hmm.
It's one of
Yeah.
like, you know, however we feel about Russia, like separate that to just the facts of
Yeah.
they were the first ones to start research on
Yeah.
EMF and they have the most regulations, which is
Yep.
interesting. So something they
Yeah. And that's kind of the scary thing. People discredit some of the research that's being done in these countries that we might consider volatile,
right.
or a country that we really don't want to put support behind. But it's like, you look, they're doing some important research,
Yeah.
and we
You have
really
to
need to
separate the
pay
politics
attention.
from, yeah.
Exactly. I don't care where the research comes out of. I mean, I'm going to look at it and say, okay, wait, who are these people that are doing it? And is this, associated with any sort of, medical type establishment, a school? Is this just some, Joe Blow off the street
Right.
that decided to do this? But
What kind of
I
journal
mean,
published
yeah,
it? Yeah, we're doing
yeah.
a episode on that. I'm so excited. Dr.
Oh,
Kent Chamberlain, who's the president of the Environmental Health Trust,
mhm.
who helped like sue the FCC on the children's in the children's
Yeah.
health defense. So he's got a lot of really awesome insights. But he's going to be doing an episode on how to tell the difference between like a fringe journal and a legitimate
Oh, that's
journal, because he's like,
awesome.
because the
That's
telecommunication
good.
companies, all they do is say, oh, well, all the information's coming from fringe journals. And he's like, I thought that when I started researching it. And then I started looking into all the different journals who are publishing,
Mhm.
these studies that are indicating harm. And it's like, wait, no, all of the fringe
Yeah.
journals are the ones that are being paid for by these
Yep.
telecommunication companies to do these very manipulated studies. And,
Mhm.
and to have something that says that it doesn't necessarily bring harm.
Yeah. And that's what people want to cling to. They just want one study that says you're
Yes.
gonna be okay. I mean, it's kind of like when people make the mistake of going on the internet and researching their symptom. They just want one
Yeah.
result to come back
I just want one
saying,
thing saying Diet Coke is
yes,
okay to drink at least once a day.
right?
Like
Exactly. I just need one and then I'm okay. Never mind the 400 other ones, but I just need
exactly.
that one. And,
Exactly.
and and that kind of comes back to the whole mold mycotoxin EMF thing. It hasn't been extensively studied like, because again, EMFs have been studied, but, related just to the EMF itself,
Right.
not, and human health. We're not looking at what does it do that impacts other
Like Lyme
bacteria,
disease or
viruses. Exactly. And so the few studies that are out there are also kind of so, I think, over people's heads too. If you were to just read about it, you're like, uh, huh? I don't like what? You did
Yeah.
what? But it's pretty basic. I mean, all the studies that have been done, and really there's four prominent ones, but I mean, really, it took mold, it measured what was happening in terms of its growth. It measured the mycotoxins that were being released, and they were done in controlled environments that did not have any sort of exposure. So basically, they put the mold in a Faraday cage.
Right.
And I mean, for anybody who doesn't know what that is, it's basically a special silver cloth that, protects it from, any of the EMFs coming in. And they did continued measurements to see what the average growth of, active mold was and what the average release of mycotoxin was. Then they exposed it to varying levels of EMFs. And when they did that, whoo, I
Right.
mean, it exploded. And it doesn't really matter, looking at each individual study, like, okay, did it explode 600 times the
I
amount?
think it
Did
was that. It was like
It was, yeah.
600% or something
Yeah,
crazy.
that was
I
Dr.
remember seeing that.
Klinghart's. Yeah, that was Dr. Klinghart's study. And it, for me, I'm like, it doesn't matter if it's 600 times, 2,000 times, 10 times. The fact of the matter is EMFs impact mold growth and mycotoxin production, and not in a good way. It's not disrupting those where they can't do it. It's making them far, 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 far worse. And that's where I think the indoor mold issue really took the turn, and where it's so important to understand that connection for people, because it doesn't matter if you literally just have one Wi-Fi router, a refrigerator, and a microwave, and you don't use any other electricity. You're still adding EMFs into your environment just by using those. And so if you develop a situation where you have an active mold growth happening, doesn't matter if it's small, doesn't matter if it's large, it's going to be worse in the presence of EMFs. And I mean, how many of us actually get rid of EMFs from the inside of our homes every day at some point? We don't. I mean, they're
Right.
constant. And
Yeah.
we can use different products. We can protect ourselves personally. We can, add some things that do some disruption within our home, but it doesn't clear it out 100%. I mean, it's, there's not something, unfortunately, I wish there was, but there is not a magic bullet right now to completely 100% eradicate the EMF load that is happening inside a home. And so until that technology happens where we're able to completely not just disrupt, but eliminate EMFs 100%, if you end up with a mold issue, you're going to have a worse mold issue. And if there are toxigenic molds that produce mycotoxins, those mycotoxins are going to just be, I mean, literally all cylinders firing, because that's a threat to the mold. The EMFs are a threat to the mold.
Yeah.
The EMFs are I mean, you think of mold like a human body, the EMFs are attacking the mold spores. They're attacking their genetic makeup, their DNA structure, because they don't want the mold to be able to replicate. Just like what it does in our own systems, it attacks our systems and, tries to basically disrupt our processes. So that's what it's trying to do to mold. And that's what makes mold angry. It's like, ha ha, ha ha. So now
We've
we
unlocked
have
the
to,
beast.
yep. I mean, now we have to produce more mycotoxins. And again, the mycotoxin conversation is so foreign to everybody. I mean, I will talk to some very mold savvy people, and then I suddenly pop out the word mycotoxin and it's dead silence. And they're like, hey, what, who?
Yeah.
I'm like, mycotoxin. And I think I love to throw this in because this is kind of that startling moment for people. I had one mycotoxin, which was unusual because I had a lot of different kinds of mold. But because I had Stachybotrys in very, very high amounts, it produced a mycotoxin that basically kind of like it's the mycotoxin. It will take over everything else. So I had trichothecene, and I said, so like to better understand what that is and the severity and really what you're dealing with here, if you go look up biological warfare, most everybody knows biological warfare.
Yeah.
If you go look up the ingredients in biological warfare, there is one ingredient in biological warfare, and that is trichothecene. That is a mycotoxin. That is biological warfare. And when I tell that to people, pale. I mean,
Yeah.
there's like everybody's face just drains of color, and they're like we've been
Same.
exposed to biological warfare. I'm like, yes, you have.
Yeah.
That is what that is. And so that realization, then they're like, oh my God, get it out of the house.
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly.
now we need it out.
Yeah.
Um, and so even, remediation practices have evolved. I mean, thank goodness finally the EPA has said, don't use bleach on mold. I mean, that was for me like,
Thank
oh
you.
my gosh, we've only been fighting for this forever. And so, remediation practices have changed. There's a lot of different ways of going about doing it. I mean, removing mold is always the best way, not just putting a treatment of some sort on it. But, there's a lot of ways to tackle it. But mycotoxins, that's new. I mean, nobody is talking about mycotoxins. Nobody's figuring out how to get rid of them. And, luckily there are a couple of products that are very, very well tested and have seen high success rates in being able to help people get the mycotoxin load out of their home.
So is it like
Um,
what is it? Is it like a fan of some kind that like sucks stuff in? How does it work?
No, no. So mycotoxins are even smaller than mold spores. That's the problem. So just coming in with your standard air scrubbers and doing, what you would kind of do normally environmentally is not going to grab these mycotoxins, and they're sticky. So they stick on stuff that a mold spore typically wouldn't find itself on. I mean, you don't find high loads of mold spores sticking to plastic. Mycotoxins, it's a chemical. I mean, think about what chemicals are capable of doing. They can permeate differently than a mold spore can. They stick on things in a different way. And so, and they're invisible. I mean, not that a mold spore, one single spore is visible to the naked eye, but if you look and kind of look around and see your dust load in your home, you're like, oh, there's some mold spores in there. Not necessarily the case with the mycotoxins. They can be glued to your wall and you're never going to know. And so there's a couple of approaches. First, you have to do what's called a small particle cleaning, and nobody wants to do that. It is so tedious. And when I say small particle, we're talking about cleaning literally like the envelope. I mean, we're
Mm.
we're cleaning every single solitary thing in somebody's environment, from scrubbing walls to, big pieces of furniture, to tiny impossible spaces that you would never realize a piece of dust was collecting in. Um, so, the small particle cleaning becomes very, very, very important. And it really needs to be done by professionals that know how to properly small particle clean. I mean, I've walked people through doing it in smaller spaces, and I will get a phone call 5 days later saying, I haven't even finished a quarter of this space. I'm like, I tried to tell you.
Yeah.
Like,
Hire
you
somebody.
literally need, yeah, you need a team. You can't do this as one person. But even physically removing as many of the mycotoxins as you can, you won't get them all. And so that's where then using a couple of different protocols becomes very, very important. And so the two protocols that are out there right now, one is more of a botanical based protocol through a thermal fogging method.
Okay.
And for anybody who doesn't know, thermal fogging is a dry fogging. So it's very safe to use with, electronics and things like that. So you don't have to really remove a lot from your home except living things, people, pets, plants.
Yeah.
Um, and the thermal fog, if you've ever lived on the coast or been to the coast, it's like a pea soup, you can't see your hand in front of you type of fog. And it permeates into every space that it can possibly get to. And because it's so thick and so small, it can get into nooks and crannies and cracks and crevices. And so as long as it can touch the mycotoxins, it essentially denatures them and it disrupts the chemical structure, and they no longer will be harmful to human health.
Okay.
And just as a reminder to everybody, mycotoxins don't replicate on their own. So this is not an issue of having to stop the replication of like we would a mold spore. We want to disrupt the ability to replicate. This is completely disrupting the chemical structure so it cannot harm human health. And then, of course, after the fog has settled, then there's a whole other cleaning protocol. And it's not that the fog itself doesn't leave like a residue, but again, it's dropping everything down as the fog starts to settle. So the fog goes to the farthest, highest spaces, and then you get back pressure and it starts to fill to the ground. And then as the fog begins to dissipate and move, it starts to come down. So you really do want to try to grab anything that this fog has settled on to horizontal spaces.
Mm.
The other method is a two-pronged process. It's essentially raising the humidity levels, which everybody's like, nope, we don't want to raise the humidity levels. I'm like, no. You're using a specific product. And so it's a hypochlorous acid-based product, which is basically, it's salt. It's a magic salt. And I could spend the next hour explaining the science behind that, but essentially it is a magic salt. And you spray your entire environment, raising the humidity. And as this hypochlorous acid lands on things, it is in its own self tackling issues with mold and mycotoxins.
It's hypochlorite. How do you say it?
Yes, there's hypochlorite. There's all kinds of hypochlorous acid.
Okay, so that's not sodium chloride.
No.
Okay. Or no, it's not. Yeah. It's not chlorine dioxide.
I'm sorry, not chlorine dioxide. Yes.
Yeah. So okay.
That comes next. The chlorine dioxide is the next step in the process. And so you're raising the humidity with this, and you're actually, getting it on stuff that might have some mold spores and mycotoxins. But then you come in with the chlorine dioxide bombs. And between those two, they work synergistically. And there have been studies. Now it has to be formulated properly. I mean, this is not something you just like go and order and hope that you're doing it right.
Right.
Has to be the right concentrations. Otherwise, you're not really, having the effect. But in the right concentrations, done the proper way, it can actually, completely eradicate up to like 98% of all mycotoxins that might be in your environment. And with no cleaning. You should do some cleaning, but if you chose not to do any cleaning, you're still going to get that level of removal. And it works in a different way. Instead of like disrupting the chemical structure, you're talking like it just completely blows all of this apart.
Wow.
And so it's the research that has been coming out about this system is so exciting, because previously really it was just only this botanical based process of thermal fogging, which is it's easier in some ways, but you got a lot of cleaning involved. A lot of people get a little nervous. They're like, technically isn't chlorine dioxide a chemical? Like, I'm chemically sensitive. So am I. I do these treatments for people a lot. And it does not bother me in the least. You need to wear a respirator. You're not wanting to breathe that in or anything like that. And you need to air out the house. But it's the first treatment that has had so many studies done that has shown that it gets to that level. And I'm really excited to hopefully see more and more things come out and get into the forefront. Again, mycotoxins are, kind of this elusive thing. And so many people stay sick, and even practitioners don't necessarily, really good practitioners understand mycotoxins. But there are still a lot of newer practitioners. They might be really understanding of mold. They still don't really understand the mycotoxin picture. And so for so many people, they don't have to continue this cycle of suffering if they just knew, okay, it's this mycotoxin piece. But I am still met with so much resistance from people. I don't want to do that.
I know people drink that stuff. So, like the chlorine dioxide is, there's so much stuff about that. That's a whole other side topic. But I had the same initial reaction about it because my mom was the one who was like, you really got to look into chlorine dioxide for the mold stuff. And anyway, but as I started researching more and more, I was like, okay, well, there's got to be, I'm pretty sure they use it in water treatment facilities, and there's all kinds of stuff. Yeah. So it can't be that.
It's not something that just popped up, a year ago. Like, this is a miracle, but it's more the combination of how that works with the hypochlorous acid, having how you do it properly, raising the humidity so it works the most effectively, making sure it's dark, doing these treatments at night. You just don't want to set this off at noon and expect that it's going to work. It breaks down very quickly in light. So you need to have a dark
Okay.
atmosphere. I mean, there's a lot of little
Yeah.
things that,
So are there like experts doing this throughout, or
Mhm.
is it kind of like new?
Right now, so it's still pretty new. Right now, and I love this for this company. It's a newer company, and it's a woman-owned company. These are women who are experts in mycotoxins and mold and just environmental health in general. And they've come together, and now they actually do have a company where they do mycotoxin removal.
That's
And
awesome.
I'm like, oh my gosh, I want this to go nationwide. So right now they're based in Nashville, and they will do consults. And in some cases, they will get their team on a plane
Yeah.
for the right cases. But I really am excited and hope that they grow, because this is the first, type of remediation. They do not come in and remove walls and, do those kind of things. They are coming in solely to address mycotoxins.
Amazing.
And it's more affordable than people think. I mean, you can do it yourself. I have walked people through it, and they've done it and they're like, "Oh, it wasn't that bad." Like, okay, once we did it, it really wasn't that bad. I'm like, "No, it's not that bad." The worst part is strapping on an electrostatic fogger and having to spray your home down. Like, that's the
Yeah.
chlorine dioxide, as long as it's formulated correctly, you put some water, you drop it in, you get the heck out of Dodge. I mean, there's
Yeah. Let it
not a
air
lot
out,
to that.
whatever. Yeah, that's
Um,
amazing. I love hearing that.
yeah,
I'm gonna like look more into that because I feel like it'd be cool to do a treatment like that for our new home just to like make
I
sure
did.
we're coming in,
Yeah.
we're coming
Yep.
in clean.
Yeah, I did twice. I did a treatment basically once they got the drywall on, because I mean you can't do it with fresh air coming in. You're not going to do it
Yeah.
in a stage. But I did the treatment once they got the drywall on and everything was closed up, and then before I moved in, after everything was installed. And the interesting thing is the chlorine dioxide also disrupts VOCs. So for people who are very sensitive to VOCs, especially if you're coming into a newly built home where it's just off
Yeah.
gassing, like, I mean, I had my little VOC monitors going and was like, "Ah, nope, can't
Yeah.
move in today." Doing that treatment significantly lowered that as well. So, it has a lot of value outside of just the mold mycotoxin picture. But
I want
I'm a
I
big
want your tool
proponent.
belt.
I know, right? Everybody's like, "Can we see your closet that has all of this stuff in it?" I'm like, "Oh, like
Yeah.
it's a fun. Let's go on a field
Yeah.
trip."
That's hilarious.
Um, but yeah, so and that's the thing, doing the chlorine dioxide treatment. I mean, again, that's kind of a bigger thing for people because it sounds a little scarier.
Yeah.
You can do a once yearly, twice yearly thermal fogging. I mean, people have to remember we are constantly bringing mold into our home. I mean, if you wear shoes in the house, you're bringing in mold. If you open a window, you're bringing in mold. You go in and out a door, you're bringing in mold spores. It's giving it food, and that's where we really want the mold prevention. And that's why it's nice that there are some things that you can do to clean the entire environment, doing the thermal fogging a couple times a year, doing a once yearly chlorine dioxide treatment, and really doing that to kind of tackle anything that you're not seeing, making sure that your ductwork is in good shape and
Yeah.
staying clean. That's huge. I mean, so many issues are because of the HVAC system, and that's sort of like the part nobody ever really thinks about.
Yeah.
So making sure you have a trusted company that's coming out and inspecting that every year, and just again listening to your body, because it's going to usually alert you to something
Yeah.
before anything else.
Yeah, I love the preventative measures. Like I want to go like make a calendar and be like, okay, this is what
Right.
happened. Once a year we're doing this. And yeah, that's so awesome. So what do you recommend to people with the EMF stuff? Like
Well,
that was one reason I was really drawn to the Aries tech. Like that's how I kind
yeah.
of came into it because I was like, okay, all of the blocking stuff, it's like it's just especially with like children, it's like, okay, well, I can't just put like a whole outfit on my child, and then learning that like that like the way that we're electrical beings, and then that kind of hit me weird was,
Mhm.
okay, well, I'm not really wanting to put a hat on my kid that's going to keep his body
Yeah,
from, you know what I mean, like the electrical flow from happening. I don't know, like that just I'm unsure about that. But I
exactly.
came into Aries because I was like, I want something that's going to strengthen our ability
Mhm.
to contend with what's going on here, because that's really the
Exactly.
only thing I can think of to do.
Exactly. And that's what I think is the most important is, and obviously, I mean, I love Aries. I have been with them and using their products since really early days. I mean, I
When the
remember when they were
website
like,
was, yeah,
yeah, I mean, I remember when they were literally like just a couple months old and I stumbled on them and reached out and was like, hey.
that's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, like, and I love it when I find that and then watch a company's journey. And I mean, and it's not, I mean, I test other products, but I always come back to Aries. They're an incredible product. They are so transparent. They are very willing to admit when they can do something better and then they do it better. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing for people who haven't been there from day one. These are not the products from day one. I
No,
mean,
they're
these are,
constantly innovating and
yes,
changing and making them better.
exactly.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
and that's important because there are plenty of products to choose from, but they're not necessarily products that have continued to advance as we continue to get a bigger burden of EMFs. And that's what's important is, and a lot of people are like, I just want something that's going to work for 5 years. I don't want to keep spending money. I'm like, nah, but
Or
that's not the
evolving too
reality.
quickly. Yeah.
And I feel like Aries too has always kept a price point that for most people is manageable, even if we have to do an upgrade in a few years because technologies have changed. And, I mean, for
Yeah.
people who are still fortunate not to have a 5G phone, which I mean, that's like super rare.
Yeah.
But, you have to do something. That's not the same phone that your little flip phone from back
Yeah.
in, 2001 was. And
Yeah.
so, I'm a firm believer in, again, you can't eradicate everything from your world because there are consequences to that, like you said. I'm personally, I do a lot with frequencies. I'm a big frequency person. I have a frequency program that I use. It scans my system. It tells me what frequencies are off balance, and then
Yeah.
I can listen to those frequencies to like reharmonize things. And that's a big component. And so, like you said, if we all surrounded ourselves at night in these Faraday type cages to try to completely block things, you're also blocking the good stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
there's good
Like your
stuff in
body's natural flow and like
Mhm.
response to nature and like all of those things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so when I try to explain different EMF products, yeah, I always encourage people go for the ones that are going to produce a harmonious response and allow your body that it has to learn how to have these things come into its system. It has to, because we're not going to prevent that from happening. You step outside of your Faraday cage, boom,
Yeah. Yeah.
no. And so, and that's the thing. I mean, I really do like the Aries product line because it helps create the balance that our system needs without getting rid of all the good stuff that our system is trying to do.
Yeah.
And you don't have to do a lot. I mean, I look at a lot of people, especially people who love to do work with like magnets and looking at all the different, strengths of those. And they're like, I'm up to like 400 gauze right now with these magnets. I'm like, but what is that doing to the rest of your system? Like, what's that pulling out of your system?
That's
Okay,
hilarious.
great, but is that the best way to go about it? And so, yeah, it's really learning about any product that you're going to choose. Understand how it works, and you know what? If you don't, call the company. I'm
Right.
a big proponent of that. I'm like, they have customer service people for a reason. I mean,
Yeah.
call and ask the questions. If you don't understand what you're reading and it's just making absolutely no sense, and you've done a search on the internet trying to understand better, and it's still like, call
Yeah.
them and say, look, I
Yeah.
need this explained for a 3-year-old. And
Yeah.
they'll do it. And then it'll make sense. And I've sent many people to customer service for Aries Tech and been like, okay, if
That's
if if this isn't working, like if
yeah.
my explanation, ask them. And then they'll like email back, oh my gosh, they were so nice. They
Yeah.
sat on the phone with me for 45 minutes and
Aw.
explained it, and I get it now. And
Yeah.
you know, and so yeah,
I did
that's
the same thing. I started using their products, and then I had the now CEO Josh Bruni on my podcast because I wanted him to like really explain it in depth, because I had like a very basic understanding, and I was mostly going based off intuition just because of like what I understood that I wanted, and then also seeing the history of the company. Because I was like, okay, it tells
Yeah.
me a lot about this company that they are not, they didn't just like see everyone's freaking out about EMF and like come up with the product. It
Yes.
was like a military funded situation
Mhm.
decades ago. It was based off research. The research was what came first, and then the product came later as it was like required basically with our.
Mhm.
And so when I was like really understanding that, and then he is able to break down like really the functionality of it, I started like really wanting to participate more in the company. So I kind of pushed myself into this position. I'm like, wait, no, I'm on board with this. I actually like am
Yeah.
really on board with what you guys are doing. And I loved the transparency of it and the willingness to just like have, because my podcast wasn't that huge or anything, you know, and it was like, he came on and spent an hour and a half, like really breaking it down.
Mhm.
I thought that was really awesome. So,
Yeah.
and
And
then I have
that's,
my grounding pads on my bed now, and I have, you know, my other things
right.
I do, but
Yeah,
it's
and that's the thing, I'm not a big pushy salesy person on my site towards a specific product. I have
right.
a lot of options I discuss for people because I would rather educate and then let people continue doing the research, because in my opinion that always feels better, because like you said, I think you come to a place where you're like, intuition is just telling me that this is what's going to work for me. And I've definitely tested some products literally going on intuition, where I'm like, nope, nope, this isn't it. And I mean, I get a pretty good response to EMFs when like I said, I have a substation right here, so I'm a good test person. Like if I go out without my protection, my little hairs bristle, and I'm
Yeah.
Italian. I have a lot of little arm hairs. So there's plenty to see there. And I have a pretty immediate bristly reaction in response. I mean, when I've had a fly and go through the scanners, I mean, it's like, bing!
Yeah.
And even with protection on, because you're getting assaulted by it.
Right.
And so, and it's funny, like I had to have a CT scan, and oh my gosh, my little arm hairs didn't come down for like 2 days.
Oh my gosh.
They were just like, eh. And I literally felt fried. And so, when when I test different products, I can really tell, because if I don't bristle, you're doing something.
Right.
So, you
Yeah, it's been
know,
really cool to talk to some people who have had like true hypersensitivity, and like Mike Bender did an episode, and he wasn't really into any of the natural stuff. You know, like it wasn't, but he
mm,
got really sick from Lyme and then ended up being extremely sensitive to EMF. And he was saying that like he literally could not touch his keyboard. Like the electricity
mhm,
would just go running through his fingers. So he was like, it was like when I had the Aries device, it was the first time that I could touch a device and it not feel that electric current going. I'm like,
yep.
that is crazy.
Yeah, that's how I am with cell phones. Like when I got a new phone, before I could slap my protection on the phone, I mean, I get it. I call it my EMF rash. I mean, my hand instantly, and it's like, I mean, anybody who's had neuropathy, it's like instant neuropathy in my hand. And
Yeah.
it's just like, don't touch it, put it over here, get
Yeah.
home and get your sticker on that
Yeah.
phone. Like,
I get
do
that with
not
like
pass
my pinkies.
go.
Yeah. My pinkies
Yeah.
go like numb whenever I'm holding my phone. It's so weird. Okay. Where
Mhm.
can people find you? We've been going almost 2 hours. I love it
Yes,
so much. This
I
was
know.
a good episode. Thank you so much for breaking this down. I feel like this is the perfect segue from like the medical side and then going into like the actual like functionality of it all. Like, what do you do and how do you find it and
Absolutely.
all the things? So, where can people find you and connect with you?
So on the mold side of things, I'm at moldhealthforyou.com. That's all spelled out. I do consultations with people all over the world. I have clients in India, the UK. So there is no part of the world that I'm not willing, as long as you
Amazing.
speak English or have a translator, I
Yeah.
am happy to have a consult with you. We can, I do email consults. I do actual, Zoom consults, iPhone, FaceTime consults, but I'm very willing to work with people wherever you are in your journey, whether that's discovering what the problem is, whether you already have a remediation plan but aren't too sure about it, whether you're post remediation and still sick. So, yeah, moldhealthforyou.com. You can go to the Work With Me tab, gives you all of the details about how we can work together. My website itself is, I mean, it's constantly being updated. I'm always making changes with, any new studies that I can throw into an article to help support it. So tons and tons of information there. Use the search function or email me if you're looking for something specific. And then on the natural health, natural living side of things, I keep them very separate because there's a lot of regulations around that. So I do not touch health topics on Mold Health for You. But and this is the fun one, hybridrastamama.com is my website that I started back in 2011. And so that has a lot more towards natural living. I do have mold health related topics on there. I have a whole tab on there that covers a lot of different things related to that. So anybody can contact me through either website. I am interchangeable in that regard, but that's where you can find me.
Yay! Thank you so much. That was seriously amazing. I'm going to listen to
Absolutely.
that multiple times.
I know.
And
I'm like, okay, you guys have to go listen to this, but like 3 times. We've got to
okay,
digest
exactly.
it.
And hopefully we'll have you back on soon.
Awesome. I'd love that. I'd love that.
Bye.
Have a good day.